morning. I'm Paul Redmond. I'm the director here at Longwood Gardens, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our institution that we'd like to think is a world apart from all others. We're so happy to have the Earth Perfect Symposium here, and we certainly hope that each and every one of you will just make yourself at home today. There are a number of our team members that are around, and if there's anything that you need at all to make your stay more comfortable, or if you have questions about Longwood, or if there's something in particular that you want to see, I hope that you will not hesitate to call upon us today. There's just one quote that I want to share with you, and hopefully it will help you set the tone for your time together today and at Longwood, because it'll really give you an idea, I think, about the philosophy of how we really embrace beauty at Longwood Gardens and all that we do. And it's a quote from Frank Lloyd Wright. "The longer I live, the more beautiful life becomes. If you foolishly ignore beauty, you'll find yourself without it. Your life will be impoverished. But if you invest in beauty, it will remain with you all the days of your life." So enjoy your time here at Longwood, and hopefully I'll see you later this evening. Thank you.
Welcome to the second morning of Earth Perfect and the commencement of another form of immersion in the garden, today with a literal experiential component, amplified by Tropical Storm Andrea. Today's first speaker is Stephen Forbes, Executive Director of the Botanic Gardens of Adelaide, South Australia. It has been a particular thrill for me to meet Stephen in the flesh at this symposium. We've corresponded now for several years, as he was among those wonderful individuals who contributed to the book that spawned this symposium. Stephen is passionate about the power of botanic gardens as an institutional framework to address contemporary challenges in plant conservation and environmental reconciliation. He views botanic gardens as the scaffolding for collecting and cultivating plants that have provided the roots of civilization. At the Botanic Gardens of Adelaide, Stephen has utilized the gardens and diverse partnerships to contribute plant-based solutions to urban, environmental, and social issues through programs including sustainable landscapes, green infrastructure, and community gardens. Stephen is currently chair of the Council of Heads of Australian Botanic Gardens and has published widely in the cultural history of plants, biodiversity conservation, and urban landscape management. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Forbes.
I just have to press F. Hey, you've done it for me. Our hearts beat with energy harvested from sunlight through the agency of chlorophyll and photosynthesis. Plants literally transform light into life. Our most important relationship beyond our relationships with each other and with the divine is with plants. The environment that hosted our evolution formed through photosynthesis, resulting in the liberation of oxygen and the capture of carbon. Our harvest of food, medicine, fibre, resins and adhesives, shelter and construction materials and fuel is almost entirely, directly or indirectly, the result of photosynthesis. Our search for knowledge, reconciliation, and even salvation necessarily invokes the transformative power of plants. Annette's given a very kind introduction. Thank you. I think I've adapted, at least Mark from New York was saying you had to get up at 2:30 in the morning to get here. I didn't. In fact, I didn't do any 2:30 in the morning, even though I travelled for 27 hours. It's one of the marvels of the international dateline. I was actually between 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. the whole time. So I'm going to talk about Botanic Gardens and the narrative of harvest, how Botanic Gardens change the world, and it is, I think it's really important to start with understanding what a botanic garden is. I love, Robert Hughes is an art critic who wrote for the New York Times an Australian, and he died about 18 months ago now. And at the time, they replayed an interview with him, which I watched. I had great respect for him. And the interviewer asked him, how did you end up becoming an art critic? How did you end up working in art? And he said, I was at St Ignatius College in Sydney, and the brothers took us for an excursion to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and there was a contemporary Australian art exhibition. He said the first thing he looked at looked like a redback spider, which is close to a black widow spider, some blobs of paint on a piece of hessian. And he turned around to Brother Connolly and said, "Brother Connolly, that's not art." Brother Connolly's response was, "If that's not art, Hughes, what is?" And he said, "I've spent the rest of my life trying to answer that question." I feel a bit like that with Botanic Gardens. I've worked in Botanic Gardens on and off for my whole life. And Botanic Gardens tend to, you can look up any definitions in Botanic Gardens Conservation International or the Oxford History of Gardens, and you'll find definitions of Botanic Gardens. They tend to be attribute-based, and they tend to be very much set in our contemporary world. I've really been trying to understand Botanic Gardens in a different framework, and I've now got a few definitions of Botanic Gardens that I'd like to share with you. I think it's important to start with that. So we'll talk a little bit about what a Botanic Garden is, and then we'll talk about what Botanic Gardens have achieved. So this is an institutional framework that I think is one of our most fundamental and earliest institutional frameworks. And it's been a furnace to drive innovation. I can make puns about it's a hothouse for innovation, or a greenhouse for ideas, but let's stick with a furnace at the moment. So we'll talk a little bit about what a Botanic Garden is, a little bit about what Botanic Gardens have done, and then we'll talk about what Botanic Gardens are going to do in the future. So let's start off. These are the bindings of some editions of Theophrastus's Historia Plantarum, and Theophrastus was sort of labelled as the father of botany in the Renaissance. So he was accorded that title, and this is one of the great texts, and no one actually knows what he looks like, but the bust at the top will do as an idealised father of botany. Historia Plantarum translates as inquiry into plants, and essentially my contention is that's what a Botanic Garden is. It's simply a plant collection established for inquiry into plants. And that institutional framework is sufficient to describe the course of civilization, which is a pretty contentious and outrageous claim. Theophrastus is the inheritor of Aristotle's Botanic Garden in the Lyceum, and the inheritor of the Peripatetic school in Athens. And there's some argument about whether there was a Botanic Garden, because of course with all of these ancients we're dealing with circumstantial evidence. The Botanic Gardens doesn't leave ruins for us to explore. So that's one definition of Botanic Gardens. If you don't like that one, I'll give you another one, which is reasonably compelling too. I was told, visiting Oxford Botanic Gardens, I was told that the inscription on this gate says something like "to promote learning and glorify the works of God," and how remarkable it was that in 1713 any institution would have the temerity to carve their mission statement in stone to exist for the next 300 years. Of course, when I actually looked at it, it doesn't say that at all. It says something like, for the glory of King Charles, and with what a great guy Danby was, who donated the gate and provided the endowment for the gardens. But it is sort of locked into the consciousness at Oxford Botanic Gardens. And I suspect now, having interrogated Oxford mercilessly, that it was in the opening speeches for the gardens, which I have got hold of, but they're in ancient English in a handwritten script that is unintelligible to me, but I'm sure I'll find someone eventually who can go through them for me. But that's actually a pretty good mission statement, and we'll pick that up. Now, it's possible, because if we look at the design of Oxford Botanic Gardens, there were intended to be 4 gates, but they ran out of money. It's not an unusual story. They ran out of money after the Danby Gate, so the others were never constructed. So perhaps the intention was to have the mission statement carved in stone on one of the other gateways. So here's another definition that we can use from 1621. Plant collections for the glorification of God and the furtherance of learning. It's quite a nice definition, because it brings in another element. It's not just inquire into plants, which we can see as furtherance of learning. There's an element there of celebration. And interestingly, God has been removed from the website because God's not very fashionable at the moment. And I think it says something like the celebration of nature and for education and learning. But it's based on this. And that's a critical part of Botanic Gardens too. It's not, the key element I think is inquiry, but there is another element there of beauty and celebration and glorification of God. So this is where I'm sort of going off the scale in a comment that's not really supported by any scholarly research. But if you accept the definitions that I've given you, it's reasonable to then go to the origins of cultivation at the Neolithic Revolution as the origins of Botanic Gardens. So the Neolithic Revolution is 10,000 years ago. Humans walked out of the forests and woodlands and began to cultivate. Now, obviously it wasn't that simple. There wasn't a great vision of, let's start, well, who knows? But the evidence is that cultivation developed in a range of centres. This is some wild wheat in the Erebani Reserve in Armenia. So these grains would have been harvested by people, and ultimately people ended up maintaining these crops rather than simply stewarding them and cultivating. So that's the Neolithic Revolution, and it happened in one way or another all over the globe. There's quite an argument as to why we did that. Well, I've picked this reference out of a Chinese source, but we could pick it in some sense out of ancient Greece with Demeter, or classical civilization with Ceres. In ancient times, the people ate grasses and drank from rivers. They picked fruit from trees and ate the flesh of molluscs and beetles. At that time, there was much suffering from illness and poisoning. So the divine farmer taught the people for the first time how to sow and cultivate the 5 grains and to examine the suitability of the earth. So these cultural myths exist in many societies, and they acknowledge a time when people did begin to cultivate. There's all sorts of arguments as to why that happened. If you look at simple energetic terms, it's much more efficient to be a hunter-gatherer than it is to cultivate. Obviously, there's some advantages in cultivation in terms of being able to build to store food in particular. And I won't get into the arguments as to why people made this shift. One of my favourites, which is beer, that people literally began to cultivate grains because they found out by accident that grains would ferment and that a beer would be produced. And the best way to get more of that was to cultivate these grains. So there's people, here am I saying, the origins of civilization and the whole Neolithic Revolution is based on the institutional framework of Botanic Gardens. But there's others that say, no, that's not right. The origins of civilization are completely based on humanity's appetite for beer. So you can please yourself on that. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about. It's probably a little bit contentious to say that that the first Botanic Gardens is at the Neolithic Revolution, but I'm going to run with it. But I think, and we could pick out a range of civilizations beyond that time, but here we're looking at the Karnak temple complex in Thebes in Egypt. And so we're looking at 1400, 1500 BC, and this is pretty good evidence. This is the so-called Cabinet of Curiosities, or the Botanic Garden reliefs on Thutmose III's tomb at Karnak. And originally, if you read some early works, there's a view that, look, this Botanic Garden is just fanciful stuff to make the walls of the tomb look nice. There's been much more research since, and detailed work published about 20 years ago now, that looks at everything, plants and animals, on these reliefs, and they're all identifiable. So virtually all. There might be one or two that aren't, and it's pretty fragmentary. So identifying something from a source like this is a little bit challenging. One of the things that's these plants aren't local plants. Some of them are, but many of them are from remote areas and must have been in the consciousness of the artist and had some relationship to the king. But we're assisted even further by an inscription on the walls of the Cabinet of Curiosities. Year 25, under the majesty of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Menkaper, which is the throne name of Thutmose III, forever living, plants that His Majesty has found in the land of Retinue. Now, Retinue's Syria. So what was a military campaign about? When Thutmose III was running military campaigns into Syria, what were they about? Of course, you might want to conquer land so they can send you tribute that makes your life easier. You might want to bring back slaves because that makes your life easier. You might want to bring back gold, frankincense and myrrh because they're good fun. Note that two of them are plant products. But critically, you would want to bring back plants because, and it's great today that we're sitting in a garden that's so closely linked to the DuPont family, because this was the predecessor of the DuPonts. If you were bringing back a plant, that's the equivalent pre-industrial revolution of the endeavours of the DuPonts. In your whole biochemical synthesis couldn't be undertaken in a factory. It was undertaken by a plant. Most of the chemicals that we looked for, and I talked earlier about medicines, adhesives, waxes, the list is literally endless. Obviously food, and food's a critical issue, and the most obvious one. Food and medicine are probably the two higher order, but all of these elements that we now synthesise artificially were synthesised by plants. In bringing back plants, you brought back the biochemical pathways and made them accessible. Now, how successful the cultivation was, and how many of these plants were utilised, who knows? We could probably deduce a few, and there's some great work on the origin centres of particular plant species. But this is a really critical point, that early military campaigns' bounty was in part plants, and a critical part. So, I don't know, I'm trying to go through 10,000 years of human history, so we'll just pick a few little episodes. And and we've chosen something from Asia, something from Africa, and we'll go to Central America now. Just to reinforce the point, this is a plate from the Badianus manuscript from 1552, which was prepared by Martin de la Cruz and illustrated by Juanes Badianus. So these were two Aztecs who illustrated the use of Aztec medicinal plants, and this is a fabulous work. We'll go to the central one here. Some of you might recognise the one in the centre here. I love it because if you have a look at the Badianus manuscript and the translation, this is a plant that was used for the relief of fatigue of public officials in the administration of their duties. Now that's something that I'm really looking for, particularly at the moment when it's budget time back in South Australia. Do any of you recognise this plant? Yeah, it's chocolate. So it actually does a pretty good job. Although they didn't eat chocolate, obviously the milk chocolate and the way we eat chocolate is a more recent invention, but the relief of fatigue for public officials in the administration of their duty was having a bath with the flowers of the cocoa tree. So which sounds pretty relaxing, actually. So the Aztec pharmacopoeia was very powerful, and again, it's not simply local plants. The establishment of botanic gardens by Aztec rulers is pretty clear. And again, if we look at the quote here, these gardens were planted with many strange and wonderful varieties of flowers and all sorts of trees brought thither from remote places. Each garden was under the special care of men from one of the 8 provinces whose services were rendered as a tribute. Now that, I'm not going to try and pronounce the names down there. I'm sure there's people here that could, but you can read them. There's 2 things here. Clearly, strange and wonderful plants that came from remote places. So the rulers were bringing plants into, in my view, what was a botanic garden. But they also brought the cultural systems of knowledge associated with those plants. So it wasn't, we're going to learn from scratch. We're going to bring these plants in, having taken them from somewhere that we've conquered, and see how we go. And the success historically wasn't that great. And there's some great examples of ancient Egypt of bringing trees back from the land of Punt that were supposed to be established. Never were, so it was a great system. Nurseries still sometimes run that system today. There's clear recognition of the value of the cultural systems of knowledge here. So we brought the people as well as the plants. So the genetic resources and the intellectual resources. And to me, that's clearly a botanic gardens to established for inquiry into plants. So we've jumped from the Neolithic revolution to ancient Egypt to, we're going to slow down a little bit now, and just explore some of the knowledge paradigms that we might be working with. I love this illustration because it's, quite a few show everything, but it shows God, it shows Adam and Eve, it shows the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life, as well as the fountain named in Genesis as the source for the four rivers that flowed from Eden. So it's pretty comprehensive. Botanists, look, I'm a botanist by training, so botanists are less interested in the symbolism as what the heck is that plant? What is the tree of knowledge, and what is the tree of life? And look, commonly we're presented with and this is, just indulge me for a moment because as a botanist I can't resist. A common view is an apple, but that's sort of more an artistic view, or an artist's view. Botanists are more inclined to say, well, it would really have been an apricot or a quince. They're more likely to have been available in the Middle East around this time. Or a fig, and there's all sorts of symbolism redolent in a fig. My favourite is Linnaeus, who wrote a lengthy treatise that I think was clear proof that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was a banana. So please yourself on that one. So there's some great work done on the establishment of botanic gardens in the Renaissance around a principle that was the gathering in of creation. So Richard Drayton uses that term, and I really like it as a term. The concept of being able to recreate Eden. And John Prest wrote on a similar topic. So their argument was that the establishment of botanic gardens was, in the Renaissance, was principally an exercise of trying to recreate paradise on earth. That if we could reassemble creation in one space, we could recreate Eden and transfer to an Edenic state. It's not really compelling, and I find the sort of biblical references a bit curious, but it was that was one approach, and I think Drayton and Prest do a reasonably convincing job of arguing that case, that Christian Neoplatonists were trying to weave the Academy of Plato and Christianity into a whole system of thinking, and with a course to reset paradise on earth. So this is just the quote: "Out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil." So it's a pretty important element when we look at botanic gardens. But let's step over to the Botanic Garden in Padua, where there's a very different story. So the Botanic Garden in Padua was established by decree of the Venetian Council, and the warrant for the establishment of the Botanic Garden is really, really clear. It's a medicinal garden. It's the pharmacy and the pharmacopoeia associated with the medical school at the university. It also supplied poisons for the Venetian Council. But if that's the case, it's we'll just explore that a little further. So here's a botanic garden which is part of the medical school, and scientists own this garden. So if you read any of the scientific literature, if you read anything by botanists, they'll accept this as the first botanic garden. They'll acknowledge that there was other stuff going on, but this is the first one where they can see science, and their necessary precondition for the establishment of a botanic garden is that it's based on science. Now, I don't accept that. I think that we can see really clearly that botanic gardens are a marriage of different knowledge paradigms. There's theological knowledge that we've seen a little bit earlier. There's biocultural or traditional ecological knowledge, which is associated with certainly the Aztec gardens. There's folk knowledge, and at this stage, if you look at the interpretations of Dioscorides' Materia Medica, much of this was folk knowledge rather than tested through a biocultural system or through a scientific process. And there's a fair bit of myth and magic involved too. So look at the layout of this garden. This is not a simple catalogue of plants. There's much more going on here in terms of design. There has been significant amount of work done endeavouring to interpret these. So yes, it did have a scientific purpose. It was associated with the university. It was a plant collection established for inquiry into plants, but it wasn't simply a medicinal garden. That's one-dimensional view. And you can see, this is a 19th century illustration from 1854. You can see that the garden has been redesigned, and it reads much more like a catalogue. It reads much more like a utilitarian landscape, which is established for a utilitarian purpose in supporting the medical school. So there's a very profound shift in the garden there, where science has started to dominate the design of the garden. But interestingly, there's the establishment of the fountain in this later illustration, and we can look at the original design being the four corners of the earth, or the four rivers leading out of Eden. One of the things that does come out at that time was, and I think this is a great quote, that dung heap, the edition of 1554, the first illustrated edition of Dioscorides, that lurid ragbag constantly being retouched but never complete, which he calls a commentary on Dioscorides. So here's Willandino, who was the curator of the Padua Botanic Gardens, having a pretty serious go at Mattioli, who had republished an edition of Dioscorides. What's interesting about that criticism is it was based on two things. It was based on Mattioli's ignorance of classical texts, and that's sufficient to damn him, but it was also based, and the criticism comes from others, on the fact that Mattioli didn't have a garden of his own. So he didn't grow the plants, he didn't have a herbarium of his own, so what could he possibly know? And that just reinforces that whole point. It's a plant collection established for an inquiry into plants. If you don't have access to the collection, it's very hard to develop the intellectual capital to work effectively with plants. And that's a point that comes out time and again, that simply seeing plants in the field provides one perspective, and that's the basis of quite powerful traditional ecological knowledge or biocultural knowledge, but cultivating them provides a completely different lens onto the plants, and the herbarium of dead plants is probably a necessary evil, because annual plants obviously aren't around the whole year. You can't study them the whole year. There is value in having, as well as a hortus of live plants, a hortus mortis of dead plants. So we're up to the Enlightenment now. This is Linnaeus, who's the father of taxonomy. I'm sorry, I don't know who the mother of botany or the mother of taxonomy is, but we've had the fathers of both. This is Linnaeus and holding Linnea borealis. And Linnaeus is justly famous for establishing a lingua franca for the plant world. So if I pick up a book in Chinese, everything will be in Chinese except the Latin binomials. This system, when I talk about the plant in Linnaeus' hand, Linnea borealis, when I read a Chinese book, that won't be in Chinese characters. The rest of the book will be. So it's provided this astonishing ability to communicate. And there's a view that Linnaeus was driven by this relentless drive to classify the natural world, to make the natural world accessible to science and to understand it. Linnaeus was as much an economist as he was a taxonomist. So Linnaeus is credited with establishing schools of economics, professorships in virtually every Swedish university. And if you read, if you're crazy enough to read things like Adam's Wealth of Nations, you know, Linnaeus was certainly in his library. So he did contribute significantly to economic thought. But economics then had a very different meaning. Economics is based on Aristotle's term, the administration of the household, or the management of the household. It's the same root as ecology, eco for home. Ecology's study, and a much later invention, economics, is quite ancient, and it's about the minimisation of waste and thrift and effective management of our home. So Linnaeus, as an economist, was really interested in economics in terms of the minimisation of waste from a theological perspective in significant measure. So this economy of nature, and I love this, I recommend this very highly. At this time, so this is notionally written by Isaac Bilberg, after whom Bill Burge is named. But in those days, when you enrolled in your PhD, because you're paying money, your supervisor wrote your dissertation for you. And then you had to defend the dissertation that your supervisor's written to a panel. And I think if you think about it, the student's paying the fees. Why is the student writing the dissertation? Why isn't the supervisor writing the dissertation? So this is often credited to Bill Burge, quite rightly. He's notionally the author, but it was written by Linnaeus. And essentially, it's James Lovelock's Gaia theory. This is a theory that God created the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the lithosphere for the benefit of man, and that man's responsibility was to steward God's gift. So the economy of nature is an Enlightenment Gaia theory. And it's really important that we understand Linnaeus in that context. His Botanic Garden, you can see, is pretty utilitarian. So this is in Uppsala, and this is where he drove his system of classification. He also had a strong view of economics here. So Sweden didn't have many colonies. I don't know if they had any. But he wanted the benefits of exploration and colonisation to accrue to Sweden. So if we haven't, if we don't have sugar plantations in our colonies, how can we reap the benefits of this exploration of the world? Linnaeus' view was we could establish tea, coffee, sugar in Sweden. Now, he didn't have much success with that, but it was economically driven. That was part of Linnaeus' manifest, that he was establishing a system that not only had a purpose for we might think a scientific classification, but had an economic purpose. If you wanted a plant, you needed a specific name, so that if you landed in a different place, the commerce would be dependent on a common language. So think about Linnaeus as establishing a binomial system from a theological perspective, from an economic perspective, as much as from a scientific perspective. Scientists like to claim Linnaeus as one of their own, but I'm just suggesting that he's not. He's from the other side. So here's Linnaeus' achievement, and he wrote this towards the end of his life. One can read nature's book as easily as any other tract. So he wasn't there saying, I've elucidated a system for plant classification. He was allowing all of us to read God's creation in the same way as we can read God's word in the Bible. So that was Linnaeus' achievement. Linnaeus' humility is renowned. I only added this quote last night because I just think it's so fabulous. This is Linnaeus speaking of himself in the third person. Now, there's not many of us that do that. God has suffered him to peep into his secret cabinet. God has suffered him to see more of his created work than any mortal before him. God has endowed him with the greatest insight into natural knowledge, greater than any has ever gained. The Lord has been with him whithersoever he has gone, and has exterminated all his enemies for him, and has made of him a great name as one of the great ones of the earth. So he was reasonably humble. So, if we, the same time, similar time to Linnaeus, there was this age of exploration and exploring the world. And in Australia, the sort of Columbus and Lewis and Clark combined is Captain James Cook and Joseph Banks. They're sort of put on a pedestal far beyond any other explorers. This is Joseph Banks. In the middle, Daniel Solander, who was a Swedish botanist that accompanied Banks and was a student of Linnaeus, and Omai, who was a Tahitian prince, just happens to be in the illustration, who happened to be in London at the same time. But Australia was explored, and the east coast of Australia's first recorded exploration is in 1770 on Cook's voyage. Cook's voyage was to view the transit of Venus, that assisted in knowledge for navigation, but also under sealed orders to discover Australia. He was largely supported by Banks. So Banks, Solander, a number of artists, there was a naturalist, Banks's assistants, his dogs, his goat, everything else really drove Cook's voyage. So Cook's voyage was very much about botanical exploration. But there began to be a shift that it wasn't simply about exploration, it was how do we derive benefits from that exploration. This is a view of Captain William Bligh from the Bounty in Tahiti, popular spot. In 1787, and Bligh is there to collect breadfruit trees to provide food for slaves in the West Indies to support the sugar plantations. Now, Bligh has a reputation as mutiny on the Bounty. So he was thrown off his ship, and people think that he was a harsh master and a martinet, pretty good navigator because he got the longboat back to Timor. But the usual thing for a captain of a ship was to drive the crew relentlessly. So when you got to a place like this, sure, you've got to wait while you harvest the breadfruit trees and grow them before, 6 months later, I'm not sure how long they were there for, they can leave and take the breadfruit trees back. And instead of driving the crews to sound the waters and chart new islands and just keep them busy, he said, look, we're not that busy. We've got a few months. Just kick back. So they did kick back, and they married local women, and they had a really good time. And then he said, it's like, well, we've got to go back to work now. And they weren't that enthusiastic. So in his later life, Bligh wrote his memoirs, and part of it is here. The object of all former voyages to the South Seas undertaken by command of His Present Majesty has been the advancement of science and increase of knowledge. This voyage may be reckoned the first, the intention of which has been to derive benefits from these distant discoveries. So here's Bligh looking at his work going, okay, previously we've discovered things for science, now we're starting to utilise them. This is the economic perspective. And that then improvements in navigation, very strong improvements in navigation, and later, I think it's the 1830s, the establishment of the Wardian case, that meant that plants could be shipped. So the Wardian case is, you look at it and go, well, that's simple. Why didn't someone think of that earlier? But it's basically a wooden case with a bit of a glass top. But it meant that tropical plants could be transported, any plants could be transported. Before that, you had to have viable seed. Chances of getting a plant back, unless it was a particularly hardy, were pretty limited. So improvements in transport, improvements in knowledge resulted in a very significant change. Part of it was economic. So we've looked at breadfruit, and this is Sir Henry Wickham standing by the largest original plantation rubber tree grown from seed collected by Wickham in Brazil. This is in Botanic Gardens in Ceylon in about 1913. Wickham made himself something of a celebrity by claiming to have stolen the rubber seeds from Brazil that eventually saw not the collapse of the Brazilian industry, but the collapse of the Brazilian monopoly through the establishment of plantations based on plants in botanic gardens. So Ceylon, in a number of botanic gardens, Singapore, Penang, all grew Wickham seeds and eventually built up enough to establish plantations. So Wickham's view was that he was pretty cavalier and what a great thing he'd done. My understanding is that there was actually no controls on the export of plant material in Brazil at that stage, so it's not something that the border would have even looked at. So we'll go, this is a capriccio of Adelaide Botanic Gardens. I can't, I have to show off a bit of Adelaide Botanic Gardens. This is around 1865, so the gardens had been established for 10 years at this stage. And I'm using Adelaide just for the next step. The age of exploration expanded from a clear industrial economic purpose, the establishment of plantations, to a much greater interest in the commodification of plants. So here's the director of Adelaide Botanic Gardens at that time, Richard Schomburg, and Richard and his brother Sir Robert undertook the early botanical, ethnographic and geographic exploration of what was then British Guiana in South America. So we could use any number of plant explorers for this illustration, but I'm inclined to use one right next to home. And this is, they were part of Sir Robert and Richard were part of the discovery for science, because obviously Amerindians knew of the giant Amazon water lily, Victoria amazonica, for tens of thousands of years, but these expeditions resulted in Lindley's description of the giant Amazon water lily. And of course Schomburg wanted to build a house to show that off, so this was built in 1868 or thereabouts, and flowered the lily shortly after. The first flowering was only in 1849 by Joseph Paxton at the Duke of Devonshire's estate in Chatsworth, and the description of John Lindley's was only 1837. But there was, we didn't have David Attenborough, we didn't have air travel. People's experience of plants was through the lens of botanic gardens or other plant collections, and primarily, unless you were very, very wealthy, through botanic gardens. So this is where people had an experience that we don't really understand today, because we're saturated with fabulous David Attenborough documentaries. We're able to travel freely and we can have a very different experience. But of course at that time this was the experience. Here's the Palm House and the 1852 Water Lily House at Kew Gardens. And this is the Crystal Palace. Many of you will know this story, but it is worth reiterating. It's just such a great story. Paxton was a lunatic. If you read his employment at the Duke of Devonshire's estate, he was there at 4 o'clock in the morning climbing the fence, getting the gardeners to work, and he'd married someone, he'd proposed to someone in the Duke's house, I think, in the first morning. Well, that's the apocryphal story. But he was the first to successfully flower the giant Amazon water lily, and he then built a much grander glasshouse at Chatsworth Estate based on the architecture of the leaf. His success in that ended up being transferred to his design for the Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. I've put this in, just talk very briefly about the opportunities with biomimicry. But our modern cities of glass and steel are all based on the giant Amazon water lily. And I should plug Thomas Anisco's new book, Victoria the Seductress, which is published here at Longwood. And I think it's only been out for the last few weeks, and you can buy it in the shop here. It's fabulous. It's got some very good images of the Lily House in Adelaide Botanic Gardens too. But that will tell you that story in much more detail. So here we get to a point where there's a real shift, and I've used John Stuart Mill's quote here, the ways of nature are to be conquered, not obeyed. So this is the Industrial Revolution. This is when we started to utilise fossil fuels, which of course are still plant-based. They're just ancient. And there is a profound shift in our relationship with plants. There's a shift from our realisation that our hearts beat as a result of sunlight trapped by plants to a view that we don't have to be subject to the laws of nature. So that takes us into what the role of Botanic Gardens is in a contemporary setting. Talk a little bit about ecosystem services. I have to say I'm astonished here. There's more chlorophyll per acre here than there is in the whole of South Australia. It is so green, I can't believe it. I just want to take it all back with me. So this is the state that I live in, and this is a pretty good season. You can see the Thai lotus there. But this is the skin of the earth. This is plant life is critical to life on earth, and yet we still have a deep ignorance of plant function. And we've, by and large, because we've been enchanted by science, we've lost much of the traditional ecological knowledge. The value of that observation over millennia, we've said, no, we've got a much better system. So when Australia was settled, instead of paying deep attention to the Aboriginal people's plant knowledge, there was a little bit of attention paid to names a little bit, and maybe later by missionaries, but essentially it was overwritten by Linnaeus' system. So Linnaeus' system effectively devalued cultural knowledge to zero. Linnaeus is celebrated by scientists as this person that provided a lingua franca for the plant world. The obverse side of that is that system obliterated cultural knowledge, because cultural knowledge was considered to be unreliable, whereas science, through the scientific method, was reliable. And we've lost an enormous amount as a result of only accepting a single system. So we still have a deep ignorance around plant function. In Australia, it's only in the last 20 years that we found out that smoke is the most important factor for the germination of Australian seeds after water. So that's astonishing. We've, as Europeans have been in Australia for 200 years, have only found out in the last 20 years the second most important factor for the germination of Australian seeds. And we're still profoundly ignorant of how to germinate, how to collect, store and germinate seeds. And yet, in the context of the threats to our landscape, the management of this skin over the landscape in the long haul in the face of climate change and other significant change to landscape management, we're at a loss as to how to deal with this. So one of the things that Botanic Gardens have done is established a worldwide program through the Millennium Seed Bank, originally set up the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. Many of you will know about it, and South Australia was the first to reach the 6-year target set by the Millennium Seed Bank, because the people we have are possessed. They're very, very good. But that just, to me, underscores our ignorance of how to establish systems that are more than resilient. In Nicholas Nassim Taleb's words, are anti-fragile, systems that can adapt and change. These systems are very different to the systems that we're talking about here. In this climate, on these soils, the response may be novel ecosystems. In these environments, where the plants are mainly stress tolerators, the response can be a total loss of flora, and huge areas that are impacted by desertification, by salinisation and by soil acidification. So forget about whether they're natives or not natives, just retaining a skin on the landscape is a really critical issue. So ecosystem services, we'll talk a little bit more about. Ecosystem services are the basis of water security, food security, and climate security. So I hate putting stuff like this up, but you mightn't believe me if I didn't put this up. So this is out of a paper in Nature this year. And what it tells us is the amount of transpiration relative to evapotranspiration on land. And you can go, what's that all about? Okay, if you look at an area outside here, how much water evaporates directly up into the sky as part of the water cycle, and how much of it goes through a plant? Now, intuitively, in this environment, you might go, I don't know, 20% goes through a plant, 50% goes through a plant. You know, you might have a think about that. This is the first time there's been some good evidence around that, and in many systems, it's up around 90%. Now that has profound implications for the way we look at the value of plants, even the way that we look at climate models, and this work will resonate from this point on. But it's hard to imagine that 90% of the water that leaves the ground actually goes through a plant. But if you think about it, that's like, because otherwise the water infiltrates through the soil, it's very hard for sunlight to pull it out beyond the top few inches. Beyond that, it has to be retrieved by plants. So here's an engine, here's a pump driven by sunlight through a plant that provides the basis of the water cycle on Earth. And we can talk a bit about, we won't have time, but we can talk a bit about wetlands. That's the top graph. The second one is clearly linked to that. Carbon sequestration, the capture of carbon from the atmosphere, is dependent on the productivity of plants. Trees are essentially, we tend to think of trees as rooted in the soil. That's a nonsense. They actually float in the air. Your trees harvest water and carbon dioxide to build carbohydrates. So a plant is not something which is anchored in the soil. That's sort of trivial in comparison to what the tree is actually doing. It's floating in air. And even today, there's almost as much carbon in forests, something like 670 billion tonnes, as there is in the atmosphere, 830 billion tonnes. And there's arguments about, about that and what's in soil and what's in other ecosystems. But the point I'm making is that this is a big deal. It's not a sideshow. We often get plants pushed to one side. Oh yeah, we're talking about water security, plants aren't really relevant. Or we're talking about climate security, plants are a sideshow. They're not. The fact that there's nearly as much carbon still in forests today, and we've seen earlier some of the, Emma showed a horrific illustration of Africa that showed how much deforestation had occurred, but it shows you what a rich sink of carbon forests are. The other platforms, so we said ecosystem services have a critical role for climate security, for water security, and of course for food security. And this is Ken Street from the International Centre for Agricultural Research in the dryland areas, who's been working with germplasm from ancient wheats. He was based in Syria, but he's back in Perth now. I can understand why. And so these genetic resources. So plants are critical. If we look at the sustainability of our crops, industrial systems of farming with high inputs probably aren't sustainable. Industrial systems of farming with lower inputs maybe. That will require not just genetically modified species, it'll require a much more diverse assemblage of genetic resources within a single crop. Here's these sustainable development goals. There's lots of them. The only reason I've used David Griggs is because it's recent, it's in Nature, and he's based at the same university as I'm affiliated with, so I'll promote his over anyone else's. But let's just get to the end of that sustainability goals, because this is really the bit that we need to pay attention to. Thriving lives and livelihoods depend on sustainable food security, absolutely based on plants. Sustainable water security, absolutely based on plants. Universal clean energy, so that link between climate security and energy, carbon as a surrogate for energy, a very strong link to plants, if not an absolute one. Healthy and productive ecosystems. So governance and even thriving lives and livelihoods will depend on plant production. So plants, yeah, are fundamental. So here we are. What are Botanic Gardens doing today? This is just from our strategic plan. As keepers of collections and knowledge, we are champions and storytellers of how plants shape our future. Botanic Gardens are still the narrative Botanic Gardens in mediating our harvest and as an institutional framework of innovation is as relevant today and critical for environmental reconciliation in the future. We'll hear from Jane shortly about the Eden Project, and I put that up as an image as a contemporary Botanic Garden. Jane will talk about what it does, but it's just an image. It's just say, look, Botanic Gardens will always change in their social context. So we'll go back here to say, let's do it this way. Our hearts beat with energy harvested from sunlight by plants through the agency of chlorophyll and photosynthesis. Plants literally transform light into life. Our most important relationship beyond our relationships with each other and with the divine is with plants. The environment that hosted our evolution formed through photosynthesis, resulting in the liberation of oxygen and the capture of carbon. Our harvest of food, medicine, fibre, resins and adhesives, shelter and construction materials, and fuel is almost entirely directly or indirectly the result of photosynthesis. Our search for knowledge, reconciliation, and even salvation necessarily invokes the transformative power of plants. And that's the end. Thanks very much.